2:17 in the morning, Atlanta. 23 floors above the street. A city that never fully sleeps blinks its lights against the dark, patient, indifferent, keeping its own time. One building, one floor, one room at the end of a corridor where the light should be off. It isn't. Blue light seeps through the gap under the door. And from behind it, the sound of someone typing. Fast. Certain. The rhythm of a person solving something, not searching for something. Inside, a man in a maintenance uniform, work boots worn at the toes, a company logo on his chest. His hands moving across the keyboard of the most restricted terminal on the floor, as though he's been doing it his entire life. On the screen, 11 red alerts, a $487 million error. A countdown nobody else has noticed. He doesn't look up. The door opens behind him. He raises one finger. 1 second. 2:17 in the morning. Floor 23, Reeves Capital Group, Atlanta, Georgia. The building had been quiet for hours. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the pressurized kind. The quiet of a place that runs on money and numbers, and the particular tension that doesn't clock out at 5. It just goes underground after midnight, settles into the walls, waits in the dark between the server racks and the sleeping monitors. Monica Reed had been awake for 20 hours. Not pacing, not panicking. CEOs don't pace. CEOs sit on $4,000 leather sofas in corner offices with floor-to-ceiling glass and pretend the city spread out below them is evidence of their control over things. She'd been doing exactly that, sitting, not sleeping, her heels on the carpet beside the sofa where she'd kicked them off sometime around hour 16. The skyline of Atlanta blinked back at her from the dark. Steady, indifferent, offering nothing useful. 20 hours since the first alert. 20 hours since the financial operations system had started generating error flags that nobody on her team could trace to a source. Not small flags. Not the kind you acknowledge in a Tuesday morning stand-up and assign to a junior analyst with a deadline of next week. The kind that means $487. 3 million misrun summers support from that 12 investors from Chicago to open at 8 a.m. The kind of error that doesn't stay contained. It spreads through the report the way a crack spreads through glass, slowly at first, then all at once. She'd run 3 emergency meetings, pulled in the entire quantitative team. Had Brian Thompson, who had a degree from Howard, a bonus structure that would embarrass most hemp people, and a confidence level calibrated roughly 30 points above what his track record had yet earned. Spend 4 consecutive hours with his face 6 inches from a monitor. He'd found nothing. Characterized the flags as a probable display artifact. Suggested they wait for morning and fresh eyes. She'd sent him home at 11. Because that's what you do when you've spent 15 years turning a 2-person advisory firm operating out of a sublease office in Buckhead into an $800 million capital group with 23 floors and your name on the building. You don't leave when it's burning. You stay on the sofa and pretend you know how to put out the fire. Monica had just closed her eyes. Fine, legitimately closed them with actual intention of sleeping for 3 hours before the Chicago call. Clicking, not the ambient hum of servers, not the building shifting in the cold. Actual keystrokes. Fast, deliberate. The rhythm of someone who knows exactly what they're doing and is doing it without stopping to think. Coming from the financial operations room. At the end of the hall. The room that was supposed to be empty. She sat up. The city kept blinking. A phone was on the cushion beside her and she picked it up. Already running the calculation. Security desk was on floor 1, response time 3 to 4 minutes minimum. Whatever was happening down that hall had already been for at least 30 seconds before she'd heard it. She walked barefoot. Didn't go back for the heels. The hallway carpet was the expensive kind, thick and soundless under her feet. And she moved along the wall with her phone in her hand and her thumb positioned over the security extension. The door to financial operations was half open. Blue light from the monitor. One workstation fully active, screen bright in the dark room. The clicking was faster up close. Purposeful. The rhythm of someone working through a problem who is 3 steps from the solution and already knows what those steps are. Monica pushed the door fully open with one hand. James Carter didn't look up. He was sitting in Victor Bryant's chair. The CFO's chair, high-backed, charcoal leather. The chair that Victor had personally selected from a furniture catalog and expensed at $200 to $400 because Victor Bryant held the firm conviction that the quality of a man's furniture communicated something essential about the quality of his thinking. James Carter occupied that chair in a blue maintenance uniform with the company logo on the chest pocket. and a small bleach stain on the left sleeve that hadn't been fully lifted in the wash. Work boots worn at the toes. His hands moved across the keyboard with the practiced velocity of someone who knows exactly where every key is and doesn't need to look for any of them. No hesitation, no hunting, just typing at a speed that told her this wasn't his first time solving something like this. He raised one finger without turning around. One finger pointed at the ceiling. The universal signal for "I hear you. Give me 1 second." Monica stood in the doorway with her phone in her hand and her mouth open. Because what is the correct response when you find your company's cleaning staff seated in your CFO's chair at 2:17 in the morning, typing into a restricted financial system? And his reaction to your presence is to ask you to wait? What are you doing in my system? She said it without a question mark. The way she said it turned the sentence into something heavier. James Sims typed 2 more commands. 1 second, you're in my financial operations room, I know. Still typing, eyes on the screen. 2 in the morning, I'm up. In the CFO's restricted terminal, James hit enter. The screen blinked, once, twice. Then every red alert flag on the dashboard, 11 of them, 11 separate error indicators that her entire quantitative team had spent 20 hours failing to locate, turned green. Not all at once. One by one, in sequence, like lights coming back on through a building after a power cut works its way floor by floor. The system exhaled. That was the only way Monica would ever be able to describe what she saw. The system exhaled the way something does when it's been holding its breath for a very long time. James Carter leaned back in Victor Bryant's $200 chair. He looked at the screen for exactly 3 seconds. Then he stood, pushed the chair back to its precise original position with the heel of his hand, a small automatic correction, and picked up the mop handle that had been leaning against the wall behind the workstation. The mop he'd apparently set down before sitting. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he set aside and is now deciding whether to resume. Caught Diva FB Juan Doi, he said. Column D and F were switched. 11:47 tonight. Whoever made the change did it in about 90 seconds. Fast enough that the system didn't register it as unusual access activity at the time. But the cascade it was building toward would have generated a full reporting error. He looked at the monitor, not at her. At the specific cells on the screen. At 8 a.m. when the cow file opened, $487. 3 millions in positions would have displayed as liabilities instead of assets. Monica was still standing in the doorway. Phone still in hand. Security extension still 1 tap away. Not a question. A demand for information she should already have. James ought her. He finally looked at her. He had the kind of face that gave away very little, not closed, not hostile, but calibrated. Like someone who had learned a long time ago that showing all too much of what you'd be thinking in rooms where you weren't expected to be thinking anything at all was a liability you couldn't afford. Night shift. I clean this floor. You clean this floor. Yes. And you also repair $487 million financial errors. James was quiet for a moment. He looked at the mop handle, then back at her. The number was wrong. I saw it when I was cleaning the monitor. It appeared to me the way a wrong number does, immediately and completely. He paused, choosing the next words with the same care he'd applied to the keyboard. I can't see something that far wrong and walk away from it. I tried. I got to the elevator. I came back. Monica looked at the monitor, every indicator green. The quarterly core report that had been a $500 million liability at 2 a.m. was now, she pulled up the summary screen, ran the top-line figures in her head, correct. Accurate. Exactly what it was supposed to look like before someone had spent 90 seconds at 11:47 switching 2 columns and then left. She looked back at James Carter. He was mopping. He had resumed mopping the floor in Victor Bryant's office with the same measured attention he'd been giving the keyboard 6 minutes earlier, working in parallel lines from the far wall toward the door. And the only outward indication that he had just corrected an error that her entire quantity team had spent 20 hours failing to find was that he was moving slightly faster than she imagined he usually did. Stop. She said it without raising her voice. He stopped. Sit back down. Explain what you did. He sat. She didn't mean for it to come out as an order, but it did. And he sat without argument, which told her something she filed without yet knowing where to file it. He walked her through it in plain language. No unnecessary jargon, no performance of expertise. He pointed to specific cells, showed her the original timestamp on the corrupted entry, demonstrated the formula path the error would have followed through the report. 11:07 p.m. That was when the change had been introduced into the system. She'd sent her team home at 11, which meant whoever had made it had done it after she cleared the floor. After the building was supposed to be empty of everyone except her security downstairs and the maintenance crew working their way up. Monica looked at the log, then at James. Did you introduce this error? No inflection, no accusation built in yet. Just the question that had to be asked, no. He said it the way people say things they understand to be true, well, I've already accepted, will not be automatically believed. Everything I did tonight is recorded in the system log. The original error is timestamped before I touched anything. My access starts after. He looked at the screen. Check the sequence. She checked it. He was right. She stood in bare feet in Victor Bryant's office at 2:23 in the morning, looking at a system log that confirmed Cleanings's staff had just prevented a catastrophic reporting error that would have detonated in front of her most significant current investors in approximately 5.5 hours. And she had no framework prepared for what came next. Go home, she said finally. Be back at 7:30. We're talk. James looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his expression, not calculation exactly. But what the quasi-defenseman of someone who has learned to read situations quickly because situations have not always given him much time. I need this job. You're not going to lose it. He studied her face the way someone studies a weather forecast they can't fully trust but can't afford to ignore. Then he nodded once, picked up the cleaning cart from the corner, walked to the door, stopped. The log shows who introduced the error, he said, not turning around, not just when. The username is in there. A pause that lasted exactly the right length. You should look at that part too. He left. Monica stood alone in Victor Bryant's office, looking at a terminal that a man in a maintenance uniform had just used to prevent a $500 million disaster. And Atlanta kept its lights going outside the window, indifferent to all of it. She opened the log, found the username, closed the window before her brain could finish processing what she'd read, stood there for a long time without moving. Then she walked back to the sofa to spend the remaining hours before dawn not sleeping. 7:30 arrived the way appointments that matter always arrive suddenly, despite the fact that they've been approaching for hours. Monica was already in the small conference room when James came in. She'd been there since 6, running through the questions she needed to ask, the order to ask them in, what she would do with each possible answer. A legal pad sat on the table in front of her. She hadn't written anything on it. A pad was there because 15 years of rooms like this one had taught her that legal pads create a signal of organized intention. And she had never entirely stopped using impressions as infrastructure even when she knew she was doing it. James arrived at exactly 7:30, same uniform, the bleach stain still on the left sleeve. He was carrying a gas station coffee in a paper cup with a cardboard sleeve, the kind of cup that comes sleeved because otherwise the heat is unbearable. And he sat down across from her, without waiting for an invitation, and took a long first sip before setting it on the table. He looked like a man who'd gotten 3 hours of sleep and had already made his terms with it. Is this an interrogation, he asked? Or a haven't interview? I accepted that. Took another sip. Monica set her pen on the legal pad. Walk me through your background. Start wherever you think is relevant. James looked at the Atlanta skyline through the conference room window for a moment. The same skyline she'd been watching all night, as though either of them could find a different view. Morgan State University. Accounting, 2 years. He turned back. My father got sick the first week of my second spring semester. I went home. It was supposed to be 1 semester. How long ago? 15 years, and since. Cashier, warehouse work, office support, maintenance. He listed them the way someone reads items off a grocery receipt. Accurate, sequential, no editorial comment attached. Night shifts when I could get them. Kept studying during the days. Monica looked at him. Studying what? Excel advanced functions, macro development, some Python. Nothing production level but enough to understand system architecture when I see it. Basics. He picked up the coffee again. Mostly YouTube. And I had an uncle who was a CPA. He used to let me work through his spreadsheets as a kid. He'd hide the errors and make me find them. Like a game, like Lego. Except the pieces were formulas and getting them wrong mattered. The window kept its view. Monica had spent 15 years in rooms with Wharton graduates, Harvard MBAs, analysts from the best programs in the country, people who could perform their expertise for an audience with considerable polish. She had developed over those 15 years A reliable sense for the difference between someone who understood a thing and someone who's demonstrating their understanding of a thing for the room. James Carter understood numbers. Not performed it. Understood it. The way you can tell with anyone who has actually learned to a thing for long enough that the knowledge has gone into their hands. She picked up the pen, wrote nothing, set it down. You accessed a restricted system last night. Yes, without authorization. Yes, that's as terminable as under the maintenance contract. I know, and yet. James looked at his coffee cup. The error was going to cost this company the confidence of its most significant entities before noon today. I saw it. I couldn't not see it. He looked up. If you want to fire me for fixing it, I understand the argument, but I didn't introduce the problem. Yes, Saw's voice stayed level. That did. Monica wrote something on the legal pad. James didn't attempt to read it upside down. She was beginning to understand, someone who doesn't try to access things that aren't his to access. A quality she was finding more noticeable by the minute given the circumstances that had brought him to her attention. HR ran a background check this morning, before you came in. The coffee cup paused on its way to his mouth, not dramatically, just a half-second pause. No criminal record, no credentials beyond your 2 years at Morgan State, no unusual financial activity in any account connected to your name. She set the pen down for the final time. On paper, James, you are almost entirely invisible. Something moved through his face, not quite a smile, not quite resignation. More like recognition of a familiar description. Welcome to my world, he said, and meant it without any edge. The morning light was moving across the conference room at a low angle now. Atlanta was filling up outside, the day shift arriving. The ordinary machinery of a Tuesday morning that had no idea what had happened on this floor 9 hours earlier. Somewhere on the floor behind her, the night shift was handing off today. And James Carter was sitting in a small conference room with the CEO of the company he'd been to use, and neither of them yet knew what the correct shape of the next step was. Monica stood. 7:30 tomorrow. Same room. Don't be late. James. She picked up the legal pad until further notice. He nodded once, picked up his coffee, walked to the door and out. Monica sat back down and looked at the coffee ring his gas station cup had left on the conference table, and thought about the username she'd seen in the system log at 2:23 in the morning, the one she'd closed the window on before she'd let herself fully read it. V. Bryant. She sat with that for a long time. The day shift arrived in its usual way, in clusters, in conversation, with the particular energy of people who have had breakfast and the luxury of sleeping in their own beds. Monica watched from her office doorway as the floor filled up. This ordinary Tuesday morning that had no knowledge of what had happened here while it was dark. Brian Thompson came in at 8:14, carrying a coffee from the good place 2 blocks down. The one that charged $11 for something involving oat milk and a name that describes Squaw's state of mind more than a beverage. He sat at his workstation, pulled up the morning reports, and Monica watched him see, from across the floor through the glass, that the error flags had cleared. He tilted his head the specific way someone tilts their head at a problem that appears to have solved itself. Pulled up the system log, scanned it, frowned, opened another window. Monica went back into her office before he could turn around. At 10:10, Victor Bryant arrived. Victor always arrived as though he'd been expected, which was itself a kind of preparation. He entered rooms in a way that suggested the room had been waiting for him, and he was graciously fulfilling that expectation. Suit pressed, as always. He owned several suits and rotated them on a documented schedule. Monica knew this because Victor had mentioned it once as an example of systematic thinking, and she had filed it under information about Victor that was more revealing than he'd intended. He knocked on her door twice professionally and opened it before she responded. Heard you had an interesting night. Monica looked up from her screen. Word moves fast. Building has 17 cameras and Pamela mentioned you were in before 6, which means you never left. He sat down in the guest chair across from her desk, the chair positioned deliberately lower than hers, a decision she'd made 12 years ago when she was less certain of herself and more reliant on furniture to do work she should have been doing herself. The error flags cleared overnight. I pulled the system log this morning. Did you? Your maintenance employee accessed the system. He said it with no alarm built in, just establishing shared information. A man named James Carter. Night shift. I know who he is. I know you know. Victor smiled. That particular smile of his, the one that arrived at his mouth approximately one beat before it had any business arriving anywhere, which was itself information if you were watching for it. But our Chicago investors don't. And if they pull an audit log during due diligence and see that a cleaning contractor made unauthorized modifications to restricted financial systems the night before their quarterly review, he spread his hands in a gesture of explanation, very reasonable, very measured. It reads as a control failure, Monica. Best case. Worst case, it reads as something more deliberate. Monica looked at him. The chair was lower than hers. His expression was very reasonable, and behind her eyes, working quietly, was the username she'd read in the log at 2:23 in the morning and closed before her brain could finish processing it. V. Bryant. What are you recommending? Let me handle this decision. Quietly. If Carter is clean, we document what happened. We characterize it correctly. We control the narrative before Chicago sees anything. Victor's hand settled back into his lap. Easy. Comfortable. The comfort of someone who has already run the calculation and knows where it ends. But we need clarity before the audit team arrives. Monica held his gaze for a moment. Investigate. But you don't move against him until there's something concrete in front of me. Of course. He stood. Smoothed the front of his jacket with one hand. I'll be discreet. He walked to the door, opened it. Paused with the particular timing of someone who has been holding something in reserve for exactly this moment. He shouldn't have been in that system, Monica. Even granting the best possible intentions. A version of the smile that wasn't quite the same version. Especially if his intentions were good. He left. Monica sat at her desk for a long moment after the door closed. Then she opened the system log from the previous night visit. Scrolled. For 7 p.m. Read the username again. Closed the window again. And thought for the first time about how long Victor had known she'd seen it. The thing about James Carter that nobody on the 23rd floor had bothered to observe was that he was in the building for 7 hours every night, 5 nights a week. And he had been on this contract for 3 years. 7 hours is a long time to be invisible in a place. He knew which analyst left the better snacks in their desk drawer. He knew that North Walpolter ran out of magenta ink 3 days before anyone noticed and submitted a ticket. Because the people who used that printerbrunn were not the people van elkaar. He knew the conference room for Sustside had a slow drain in the wet bar sink that had been worsening for 6 months. He knew which workstations had monitors left on sleep mode and which had them locked. And he knew this mattered in the way that knowing the layout of any room you work in Decta every night starts to matter, not through any deliberate mapping, but through the simple accumulation of attention paid to a place over time. He knew the numbers, not because he'd done anything unauthorized, because he was there every night, moving through offices where people worked until 9 or 10 and left the screen showing whatever they'd been looking at when they decided to stop. Projections. Quarterly summaries glowing softly in the dark while he cleaned around them. He didn't try to read them, but he couldn't not see them. It was the same thing that happened when he walked past a painting hung 2 degrees off level. His brain processed it to the wrongness before his eyes fully riveted it. And then it sat there, that wrongness, needing resolution in a way he couldn't override by deciding not to need it. Most nights the numbers were fine, or fine enough, with intolerances that didn't trip whatever internal alarm had been built up in him by 2 years of accounting coursework, and 15 years of looking at numbers the way other people look at weather, reading them for what they were actually saying underneath what they appeared to be saying. But some nights a number was wrong in a way that was so structurally incorrect it was like seeing a sentence with the word missing out of its middle. Your eye went directly to the gap. Your brain supplied what should have been there, and the distance between what was and what should have been became something you carried with you down the elevator and through the parking garage and all the way home. He'd first noticed an anomaly in Reeves Capital Systems 11 days before the night Monica found him in Victor's chair. Not the errors she'd watched him fix. Something smaller. A rounding inconsistency in the fixed income summary, technically within acceptable parameters. But the kind of thing that, left unaddressed, had a way of compounding through subsequent reports until it became visible in a very different way. He'd looked at it for 3 minutes on a Thursday, standing next to the workstation with the cleaning cloth in his hand, and then he'd walked away, got into the elevator, stood in the elevator for 30 seconds with the doors closed, gone back up. He hadn't touched anything that night. just looked more carefully. Traced the inconsistency back through 3 weeks of archived reports until he found the point of origin. A formula that had been written correctly and then modified slightly, in a way that would look intentional to someone who wasn't paying attention, and would only reveal itself as wrong after 6 to 8 weeks of accumulation. He'd looked at the modification timestamp, the username, and he'd walked away. Because that was the specific reality of being invisible in a building. You saw things. But seeing things and being in a position to say something about what you saw were very different situations. He understood the ecosystem he moved through every night. He understood that a man in a maintenance uniform pointing at a CFO's financial modification history and saying something looks wrong here would not land as helpful. It would land as overreach, as a problem. The kind of thing that resulted in a contract quietly not renewed and a reference call that went unreturned. So he'd watched. 3 centered less on the modification was still there. And now there was a second one, same methodology, same type of cell-level change, same username attached to the timestamp. Someone was constructing something he'd understood then, or dismantling something, slowly, deliberately, in a way designed to stay invisible until the moment it was no longer invisible and then be irreversible. He'd started a notebook, not accessing anything, not touching any system. He was doing his job, cleaning the floor, moving through the office, working his route. But now he was also writing things down. Specific cell references. Modification dates. The gap between what the system was showing and what it should have shown at. In a small notebook he kept that in the inside pocket of his uniform jacket. Because he had understood even then that if this became what he thought it was becoming, the notebook would matter. And then 11 days later, the large one. $487. Columns D and F transposed at 11:40 p.m. Not a slow accumulation, a single structural change designed to trigger at a specific moment a detonation on a timer. He'd seen it on the monitor while cleaning the screen. Had registered it the way you register a red warning light, not panic, just. That is wrong and we are not going to look away from it. He'd gotten to the elevator, stood there. The doors had closed. He'd pressed the button back up. Because $487. $3 million was going to cost Monica Reed the confidence of investors she'd spent months cultivating. Because he knew from Pamela's phone calls, what Pamela made on the floor without realizing the sound carried in an empty building late at night. That Monica had built this company from a sublease desk with 2 clients. And building something from nothing was a thing Ames Carter understood with a specificity that people who had never needed to do it could not fully share. Because whoever had put that change in at 11:47 p.m. had done it, knowing the floor was empty and curbs would just show a dark workstation. And because he could not, physically and constitutionally, walk away from a number that wrong. The morning after the 7:30 meeting, James came back in for his regular shift, and nothing had visibly changed, which was the specific way everything had changed. He moved through the floor identically to how he'd moved through it for 3 years. Workstations, conference rooms, the kitchen with the good espresso machine and the paper towels that didn't actually absorb anything. The separate corridor that always carried the smell of recycled air and electronics running slightly hotter than their rated temperature. Same route, same pace. But the awareness had changed. The quality of being observed that you only develop after being invisible long enough that any form of attention feels structurally different from what you're used to. Brian Thompson was still at his desk at 10:15 that night. Brian stayed late regularly, but his particular kind of late was usually the performative kind. The variety of staying late that requires an audience to be meaningful, the kind that ends promptly when the last other person leaves the floor. Tonight was different. Tonight Brian's was staring at something specific on his secondary monitor, the anxiety that lives at the point between discovering a problem and having to tell someone about it. James pushed the cart past the workstation, slowed without stopping. The chart on Brian's secondary monitor had the y-axis starting at 20 instead of 0. He kept pushing, reached the end of the row, turned around, came back. Because of course he did, that axis. He set it at a volume that wouldn't carry past the 2 of them. Y-axis starts at 20. Brian looked up from his primary screen, went through the sequence of processing that people went through when someone outside their expected category said something inside it. Recognition, categorization, landing on the correct category, finding the correct category uncomfortable. I'm sorry? Starting the scale at 20 instead of 0 makes the growth curve look like approximately 300% when the real figure is closer to 18. James pointed with two fingers not touching anything. And that projection line, the dotted one, the cell reference is showing 320. It should be 300, unless that division invoiced 1,000 units in a single Wednesday, which would be an interesting Wednesday. Brian stared at him. James picked up the cleaning cloth from the side of the cart. I can do the table surface after you're done. He moved to the next section of the office. Behind him, a moment later, the particular sound of a keyboard shortcut done by someone who needs to check something quickly and doesn't want it to look like they're checking. Then silence. Then an exhale Brian almost certainly didn't intend to be audible. James kept moving. He knew what the exhale meant. He also knew what came after the exhale, and it wasn't gratitude, not here. Not from someone like Brian Thompson, in a room like this one, being corrected by someone pushing a cleaning cart. What came after was a version of processing, the specific work of integrating the fact that an error in your report had been found by someone you hadn't considered capable of finding it. That processing was almost never comfortable and almost never produced a thank you. He'd been right in rooms like this before. He knew exactly what being right in those rooms cost. The cleaning cart's front wheel caught the seam between carpet and the tile at the kitchen entrance. James adjusted his grip and kept going. Victor Bryant found him in the copy room the following morning. James had been called in during the day, unusual. But Pamela had left a message with the cleaning company's dispatch office, and Monica had wanted to speak with him again. He'd met with her for 20 minutes in the small conference room, answered the same questions he answered the morning before along with several new ones, and was now waiting in the copy room for Pamela to print documents Monica needed him to sign, paperwork formalizing a temporary authorization for what he'd done to the system 2 nights ago. The kind of administrative solution to an irregular situation that Monica Reed apparently produced at high speed and with precision. Victor walked in and closed the door behind him. Charcoal Armani. Wednesday? James had cleaned about Brian's office enough times to have memorized the suit rotation, though he'd never said so. James. Victor said his name the way you say the name of something you've decided to be careful about. How are you holding up? James looked at him. Fine. Good. Victor moved to the copier, not using it, positioning himself near it in the casual way that places a peaceful virtue between two people while maintaining the appearance of informality. What you did the other night was remarkable. I want to acknowledge that first. James waited. The difficulty is, Victor picked up a stapler from the copy counter, examined it as though he'd never seen one before, set it back down. The difficulty is that what you did has created a compliance problem regardless of the intention behind it. You accessed a restricted system without authorization. An auditor doesn't see intention, an auditor sees access logs. He looked at James. The Chicago investors are doing standard due diligence. If they pull those logs, the logs show I fixed an error that was already in the system. The logs show unauthorized access by a maintenance contractor. Victor's voice maintained its register, professionally pleasant in the way that pleasantness is professionally maintained, not the way it arrives naturally. Context doesn't move through a compliance document, James. It gets stripped out in translation. James looked at the door, then back at Victor. Is there something specific you need from me? I need you to understand your position clearly. Victor shifted slightly, not closer, but the movement had a direction to it. Monica has goodwill toward you right now. That's real. But goodwill in a corporate structure has a limited shelf life, especially when questions are being asked. A pause constructed for landing. I'm going to recommend the cleaning company contract be released. Standard language. No fault assigned publicly. It's the cleanest resolution for everyone. The copy machine ran through a cooling cycle in the silence. James looked at Victor Bryant the way he looked at numbers that didn't add up directly, without performing the looking, just actually doing it. The pressed suit. The cologne that had been applied with the confidence of someone who knew it was expensive. The pleasantness that arrived in time, this conversation about 30 seconds too early to be genuine pleasantness. The log shows who introduced the original error, James said. Not just when. The username is recorded. He held Victor's gaze. Monica has seen it. If she hasn't acted on it yet, there's a reason for that. But she's seen it. Victor's expression didn't change, which was the specific thing about it. It didn't change at all. Not a flicker of surprise, not a micro-reaction of any kind. which meant he'd already accounted for Monica having seen it, which meant whatever he was building, he'd built it to withstand that. The copy machine finished. Pamela knocked, opened the door, handed James a folder, said something efficient about the paperwork, and moved on. She was just excellent at being present without being present in the ways that mattered. Victor walked out without a further word. James signed the documents, walked back through the 23rd floor, past the workstations, past Brian Thompson, who didn't look up, past the kitchen, pressed the elevator button. In the elevator going down alone, he took the notebook from the inside pocket of his jacket, opened to a fresh page, wrote the time, the date, everything Victor had said, in the shorthand he'd developed over years of rewriting, in small margins, the shorthand that looked like personal budget notes, and was actually a record of everything he'd documented on floor 23. He wrote it down because that was what you did when you understood that your own of events might be the only accurate one. And accurate records only help you if they exist. He put the notebook away. The elevator opened on the ground floor. He walked out into Atlanta, 48 feet above street level. The log was still in the system with the username still in it. Somewhere on 23, Victor Bryant was at his desk running his next calculation. And in her corner office, Monica Reed was looking at the skyline she'd been alone for 15 years, turning 4 characters she'd been carrying since 2:23 in the morning. V. Bryant. The first climax came on a Thursday. Not one of the crises she'd been bracing for since the night she'd found James in Victor's chair. This one came from the direction of the calendar, which was the direction the worst surprises always came from, the ones that were already scheduled. The Chicago investors arrived 40 minutes early. Monica got the notification from Pamela via text while she was in the elevator heading up, which meant she was already in the building when the information reached her, which meant she had approximately 40 minutes to get from the elevator to the conference room and verify that everything that needed to be working was working. It wasn't working. The presentation server had locked up. The reporting system wasn't loading. Victor was at his laptop at the head of the conference table, doing the thing people do with keyboards when all other options have been exhausted, pressing enter repeatedly, as though sufficient repetition might succeed where the previous 40 attempts had not. His jaw was tight. His forehead had a quality to it that his expensive cologne was not equipped to address. 3 investors from Chicago sat on the far side of the long table. They had the polished and quality of people who have traveled a significant distance for a specific purpose and are now watching that purpose fail to materialize. Their expressions were not unkind. They were simply waiting with the practiced composure of people who understand, professionally, that they are sometimes waited for and sometimes the ones waiting. That both experiences pass. Monica went to Victor's side of the table. How long? Working on it. Through his teeth. Estimate, 5 minutes, maybe 15. She turned to the investors with the smile she'd built for exactly this situation, the smile that communicated. This pause is temporary and managed, and I am completely in control of outcomes, including this one. We appreciate your patience. Small technical matter we're resolving. One investor checked his watch, discreetly enough to be noticed. Pamela came in through the side door with a coffee service cart, moving with her characteristic efficiency. Behind her, carrying the secondary tray with the white porcelain cups, came James Carter in the maintenance uniform. He began placing cups at the table in silence, working his way around the investors with the easy invisibility of someone who has spent years learning to occupy space without interrupting it. And then, setting the 3rd cup, his eyes moved to Victor's laptop screen. Monica saw it happen. His hands kept moving, setting the 4th cup, reaching for the 5th. But for a second his eyes were somewhere else entirely. The way eyes go when they catch something they weren't looking for and can't immediately leave. He set the 5th cup. Victor pressed enter for the 12th time. The backup sequence should have run automatically. This makes no sense. James set down the 5th cup and said quietly to Victor specifically, "Excuse me." Victor didn't look up. "Not now. I think I can see, not now." Victor looked up long enough to deliver the phrase with its full intended weight, then went back to the keyboard. The room had gone very still in the way. Rooms go still when something is said that shouldn't be said in front of the people it's said in front of. James was still holding the 6th cup. Monica looked at the locked screen, at Victor's expression, which had moved past the professional maintenance of composure into something that professional maintenance could no longer reach. at James Carter standing with a porcelain cup in his hand, looking at that laptop with the expression of someone who is holding themselves physically away from a thing they need to address. She thought about 2:17 in the morning, 15 seconds and 3 commands, 487, 3 million turning from red to green. James. She said it clearly enough for the room to locate. Come take a look. Victor turned to her. What had been on his face previously was replaced now by something with no polished name. Monica? You've been at this for 12 minutes. She said it quietly, between them only. Let him look. I know what he is. The same quiet, the same directness. Let him look. Victor stood from the chair without another word. One of the investors, the one nearest the laptop, watched with an expression of genuine curiosity he was making no great effort to conceal. James set the sixth cup on the tray, walked to the chair, sat down, put his hands on the keyboard. Complete silence in the room. 15 seconds. 3 commands in sequence, the kind of sequence that requires knowing what you're looking at before you start. He exited Windows, opened a terminal, typed 1 line of code. The screen cleared. Then the reporting system loaded, all of it, the quarterly summary, the position reports, the 32-slide presentation deck, the complete Chicago package, loading clean and accurate, and exactly as it was supposed to look when the company's systems were functioning correctly, and there was no error built into them. James sat back, smoothed the front of his uniform with the habit of someone who has been doing it long enough that it's become automatic. Circular reference in the empty cells on line 47. The server was trying to process data that didn't exist and got stuck in the loop. I reset the calculation sequence and re-indexed the pivot tables. He looked at Monica, not at Victor. It should hold. The investor nearest the screen leaned toward the colleague beside him, said something quietly. That colleague turned to the person at the end of the table. The interpreter looked at James. He wants to know if you work in the technology department. James looked at the interpreter, then at the investor who had asked. No. He stood. I cleaned this floor. The investor sat with that for a moment, looked at the fully loaded, perfectly formatted presentation on the screen, looked back at James, and then began to applaud, slowly, deliberately, in the way people applaud when they are genuinely surprised, and the applause comes from that surprise rather than from obligation. The second investor followed, then the third. 3 investors from Chicago in dark suits, applauding a man in a maintenance uniform in front of a laptop he'd fixed in 15 seconds. Pamela allowed herself a very small smile directed at the coffee cart. Victor Bryant stood to the left of the table, with his hands at his sides, and something behind his eyes doing calculations that had nothing to do with the quarterly report. Monica exhaled a breath she'd been holding for 12 minutes. James picked up the 6th porcelain cup, set it in front of the last empty seat at the table, collected the tray, walked toward the door with the focused, unhurried movement of a man who has work to return to. After the investors left, firm handshakes, good numbers. A follow-up call confirmed for the following week. Monica found James in the conference room gathering the remaining cups. Thank you. He didn't look up from the tray. You're welcome. You saved the meeting. You gave me the chance to. He set the last cup in place, straightened the tray. The investors applauded. They applauded because they didn't expect it. He finally looked at her. That's not the same as seeing the work. Nobody applauds the bicycle. They applaud the dog riding it, because it's surprising. The surprise is what they're responding to. His voice carried no bitterness, just precision. The same precision he applied to formulas. I know the difference between being seen and being a surprise. Monica had nothing to say to that, because he was right. And she had been in enough rooms to know when something true had been said in one. And this was one of those times. She watched him walk out with the tray, stood in the empty conference room. Somewhere below, the log was still in the system with V. Bryant still in it, and James Carter was walking down the hall with 11 days of notes in a notebook in the inside pocket of his uniform jacket, and Atlanta kept its lights going outside the window, and the day was not close to finished with any of them. The morning after the Chicago meeting, Monica arrived at 6, and the 23rd floor was already wrong in a way that had nothing to do with the systems. Not broken wrong, not crisis wrong, the subtler kind, the wrongness of a space where the usual order has been disrupted and nobody has yet addressed the disruption. Brian Thompson's desk had papers stacked at an angle. The kitchen rack held 3 mugs when it usually held 6. Small displacements. The kind you only register when you've spent 15 years building systems, and the system's flying on is lodged somewhere in the back of your mind, whether you're paying attention to it or not. James wasn't there. She'd known he wouldn't be. His shift was nights, but the absence registered differently than it had the previous Tuesday morning. But it was itself information she filed, without examining too carefully. Victor was in at 8, suit pressed. Cologne applied with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned whether it was too much. Hast thou stopped at her office door that knocked once in the professional way that also functions as notification rather than request, and came in. Chicago team sent a positive follow-up this morning. I saw it. They specifically cited the technical recovery. He had a folder. Victor always had a folder because folders were a form of preparation made visible, and Victor understood that visible preparation communicated a kind of authority. I think we should formalize the access situation before the audit team arrives. Monica looked at him. The audit. Standard due diligence on the Chicago transaction. They'll pull system logs as a matter of course. He opened the folder. I've drafted a resolution. James Carter's contract with the cleaning company is terminated. Standard language, no fault characterized publicly. We document the unauthorized access, noted as resolved, and the audit trail reads as a controlled situation. He slid the folder across her desk. Clean exit. The folder sat on her desk. She didn't touch it. He fixed the problem. He created a different one. Victor's voice held the patience of someone explaining a position I've already explained and expect to explain again. 1 unauthorized access is an incident. 7 unauthorized accesses across 3 weeks is a pattern. An outside auditor looks at that pattern and starts asking what else was happening in those systems during that same window. 7. She looked at Victor directly. You've been pulling the access logs. Internal security concerns fall within my responsibilities. That's not a deviation from my role. He held her gaze with the comfort of someone who has run the calculation and knows how it resolves. Each access outside business hours. Each one without prior authorization. Each one coinciding with a system anomaly he then resolved. A deliberate pause. There's a compliance term for that pattern, Monica. She knew the term. She also knew the username attached to the 1147 modification. But the username and the folder on her desk were 2 separate problems that required 2 separate kinds of courage. And Monica Reed had built 15 years of decisions, the discipline of not confusing speed with correctness. I'll review the proposal, she said. Victor stood. At the door, he stopped with the timing he'd perfected over years of knowing when to debluff for my final thought. He's genuinely good at what he does, Monica. Whatever else is true about this situation. The man is good at something he has no credentials for. A beat. That's precisely what makes the situation complicated. He left. Monica looked at the space on her desk where the folder was. Outside, Atlanta was deciding what kind of day it intended to be. James came in that night at 10, and the floor had the particular energy of a place where something has shifted during the day and is being processed without being discussed. The kind of tension that doesn't belong to any one person. It distributes itself through a space, lives in the half-second pauses in conversations, in the way people carry their shoulders slightly differently than usual. He noticed it, didn't alter his route. Brian Thompson was still at his desk at 10:15, which was late even by Brian's standards. And tonight the quality of his lateness was different, less performance, more genuine absorption. 3 windows open on the primary monitor. On the secondary, a reconciliation file that James recognized from 12 feet, and moving as the kind of document that generates errors at specific points in its architecture. If you're not careful about how you build the formulas. James pushed the cart past the desk, slowed without stopping. The y-axis error from the previous day had been corrected. Brian had spent time on it. But the reconciliation file had a formula in column pulling from the wrong row range, off by 1. The kind of offset that stays invisible through 2 reporting cycles, and then surfaces as a variance large enough to require explaining. He kept moving, reached the end of the row, and turned back around. Because of course he did.
Column H. He kept his voice at a volume that wouldn't carry.
The row reference is pulling 14 through 47. It should be 15 through 48. The header row is creating an offset. Brian looked up, went through the processing sequence. I'm sorry? Formula in H off by 1 row. It won't show up in this cycle, but in about 6 weeks the variance will compound past the tolerance threshold. Brian looked at his screen, looked at James, looked at the screen, then opened the formula editor, with the keystroke of someone who needs to verify something they don't want to need to verify. Stared at the range reference for 4 seconds, because it was off by 1. Brian closed the formula editor.
Didn't look. I know.
James moved the cart to a kitchen. Good night. Nothing came back, which was what James had expected, which didn't make the silence lighter, which was just the reality of the specific rooms he'd been right in for 15 years. The gap between being correct and being thanked for being correct was a gap Cat stopped expecting anyone to close for him somewhere around year 9. In the kitchen, he emptied the trash and wiped counters and heated water for the instant noodles he'd brought in his jacket pocket, and stood at the window eating them and looked at Atlanta and tried to read it the way he read balance sheets, looking for the pattern underneath the presentation, for the thing that was off. He thought about the username on the 1147 modification. He thought about the 7 access entries Victor had compiled. He thought about the folder Monica hadn't mentioned when Pamela left the message that morning to reschedule their next meeting. He put the empty container in the trash and went back to work. Thursday afternoon, Pamela appeared at the junction between the server corridor and the main floor and said Monica was asking if he had a few minutes, which was the kind of question that had exactly one available answer. So he followed Pamela to Monica's office and found Monica standing at the window, not at her desk. She turned around. Sit down, he sat. She looked at him with a different quality than the one she'd deployed in the conference room at 7:30. Not the CEO reading a situation, something more direct than that. Victor is recommending we terminate your contract with the cleaning company. James took that in. Okay. He has documentation of 7 system accesses, all outside business hours, all unauthorized. She pulled the guest chair around so there was no desk between them. A deliberate choice that registered as such. He's positioning it as a security liability ahead of the Chicago audit. Each of those accesses was a correction. He said it flatly, without defensiveness. The way you state something you know to be accurate and also know may not be sufficient on its own. I have records, my own records, in a notebook I've been keeping since the first night I noticed something wrong in the fixed income summary. Every access time-stamped. What I found. Monica looked at him, a notebook, in my jacket pocket. He met her eyes. I kept it because I understood early on that if this became what I thought it was becoming, my account of events might be the only accurate one available. She was quiet for a moment. A plane crossed the skyline through the window, high enough to be silent, and was gone. Victor's characterization is that the pattern fits an insider sabotage profile, someone who introduces problems and then resolves them to build credibility and access. I know what the pattern looks like from the outside. Does it look like that? No. No heat in it, just the fact. But I understand why someone who needed it to look like that, someone who didn't want anyone looking at the modification log from 1147, might find it useful to say so. Something shifted in Monica's face. Barely visible, but she spent 15 years reading rooms in, where the visible information was never the complete information. Something tightened around her eyes, not anger, not yet. The specific expression of something already known arriving from an unexpected angle and having to be accommodated. The audit team will be on site Monday. Then the modification log needs to be looked at before Monday. I've looked at it. I know. He held her gaze. So has Victor. He knows you've seen it. Which means whatever he's building right now, he's built it to withstand the log existing. He's not trying to hide it, he's trying to make it not matter. That's a different problem. The plane was gone and the window was just Atlanta again. Monica looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. I'm not terminating your contract. James exhaled quietly, with the discipline of someone who doesn't make a display of relief. Thank you. Don't. She stood. Stay out of the systems. Don't access anything outside your assigned functions. I need time to handle this in the right sequence. And I can't do that if you give Victor additional material. He stood, understood. At the door he stopped. The notebook. Can I make copies for you? Monica looked at him for a moment. Make 2. The rumors start for the way office rumors always start, not from the thing itself, but from something adjacent to it that people found more interesting. It wasn't the Chicago investors. It wasn't the board. It wasn't in the flash drive Victor had mentioned in passing to senior analysts on Thursday afternoon, doing it with the casual tone he'd used to note weather hinchich, which was Monica knew exactly how you circulate information you need in the air without appearing to have put it there. It started with a Friday lunch. Monica had come into the kitchen at noon and James had been there. He'd come in during the day again, this time to sign updated authorization paperwork that Pamela had coordinated. And Monica had looked at the instant noodles he'd brought in a container and said those aren't lunch, in the tone of someone stating an obvious fact they can't quite leave alone. And James had said, "They're what I have." And Monica had made 2 sandwiches from what was in the kitchen with the same focused precision she applied to balance sheets. And they'd sat at the small corner table. 11 minutes. Talking about Morgan State and Atlanta style and a formula about allocation method James developed over years of self-teaching. A way of annotating spreadsheet logic in the margins so that future errors became easier to trace back to their origin. Monica had understood the application immediately and said so. They'd talked about that. 2 junior analysts had come in for coffee during those 11 minutes, seen them and left. By 1:15 the floor had the information. By 2 the information had acquired a narrative. By 3:30 Pamela came to Monica's office with a specific expression she wore when she had something to report that she'd rather not be reporting. "What exactly are people saying?" Monica asked. Pamela selected from a limited supply of diplomatic options. "The consensus is that something is happening. The definition of what remains undefined, but the consensus on the existence is fairly strong. And Victor." The pause was 1 beat too long. Victor had lunch with 2 of the senior directors. "I don't know the content of the conversation." Monica thanked her. Pamela left. And Monica sat at her desk and thought about what Victor was building. Because that was the correct word for it, not reacting, building. The flash drive, the odd framing, the lunch narrative now seeded into the floor's informal communication channels. Individually, each piece was almost nothing. Together they were architecture, the kind that only reveals its shape when you get far enough back to see the full floor plan. She needed the full floor plan before Monday. The difficulty with trying to read Victor Bryant's strategy was that Victor Bryant had spent 8 years in this company developing a precise understanding of how Monica Reed made decisions. He knew her sequencing. He knew what she needed before she moved. He knew the specific threshold at which she'd act versus continue gathering. He also knew, and this was the thing that sat with the most weight as Monica sat at her desk at 7:30 Friday evening, that she hadn't moved yet. Which meant I believed he was still ahead of her. Which meant he was still building. She called Pamela at 7:45. "I need the complete system audit output for the last 90 days. Not Victor's summary. The raw log. I'll have it by 8. And the modification history filtered by user. Every username that touched the financial operations system in the last 45 days. Including my credentials. Including everything." The raw log was 412 pages. Monica read it the way she read everything when it mattered. Fast, not for comprehension, and for the thing that didn't fit the pattern of everything around it. The same way James had described looking at numbers. Not trying to find it. Not being able to not find it. She found 3 anomalies by 9 p.m. The first was the 1147 modification, V. Bryant. She'd known about this one since 2:23 in the morning 9 days ago. The second was a series of formula-level adjustments distributed across the fixed income summary over 6 weeks, each one within acceptable parameters individually, collectively moving a specific position value by 7% in a direction that made the division's assets appear less robust. Username on each entry, V. Bryant. The third was from 2 days ago, a single entry at 11:19 p.m. documented in a subfolder of the CFO's archive labeled Due Diligence, Chicago. The document was a formatted summary of 7 unauthorized system accesses by a maintenance employee, written in the language of external audit compliance, with interpretive commentary characterizing the pattern as internal sabotage. Victor had written the auditor's conclusion in advance of the auditor's arrival. Monica closed the log file, sat in her office without moving, with Atlanta doing what it did outside the window, and understood with the specific clarity that comes from seeing all the components at once, instead of as they arrive one by one, exactly what had been happening here. The sale of the technology division, $340 million, to a company whose name she'd searched and found was Callaway Technology, a mid-sized firm in need of exactly the proprietary system Reeves Capital had spent 4 years building, was the destination. Everything else was the road to it. The 6 weeks of small fixed income adjustments to shift the valuation narrative. The single catastrophic 11. 47 modification designed to create a crisis that justified emergency restructuring. The inside sabotage story prepared and ready to deploy against the one person who had documented everything accurately. James Carter had walked into the middle of a financial fraud on a Tuesday night and fixed a piece of it because he couldn't look away from a number that wrong. And Victor had spent the 9 days since then trying to transform that correction into the evidence against James. Monica picked up her phone, called the company's outside counsel, put it on speaker and opened a fresh document. She had until Monday morning and she intended to use every hour of it. Saturday, James didn't work Saturday. He had the specific freedom of a day with no external obligation, which in his experience was never as restful as it theoretically should be. And by 8 in the morning, he was at his kitchen table in Decatur, with his laptop open and his personal spreadsheet up, and the quiet understanding that something was moving toward him from a direction he hadn't fully identified yet. He did what he did when he couldn't resolve something. He looked at what he actually knew. He knew the notebook, 11 days of entries, specific, time-stamped in his own handwriting, an accurate record of what he'd seen and when and what he'd done about it. He knew Victor had 7 access entries documented and had already decided what story those entries would tell. He knew Monica had seen the 47 username. She'd confirmed it obliquely in her office on Thursday, in the way she confirmed things that cost her something to confirm, quietly, without turning it into a scene. He knew Victor knew she'd seen it, which meant Victor wasn't relying on that information staying hidden. He was relying on something that could neutralize it, even when Monica was looking directly at it, which meant the modification log alone wasn't going to be sufficient. James opened a new tab in his personal spreadsheet and started a new column, date, time. What Victor had said, what it could mean, what else it could mean, the copy room conversation, the deliberate mention of 7 accesses as though reciting a number he expected James to find alarming. The pleasant reasonableness that arrived 60 seconds too early to be genuine, the specific phrase, I'm going to recommend the contract be released, not I'm recommending I'm going to. Future tense, already decided. He wrote all of it down in the shorthand he'd developed over years of writing in small spaces. The shorthand that looked from the outside like personal budget notes and was as a parallel record of everything that had happened on floor 23 over 3 weeks. Then he made a physical copy of the notebook. Then another, photographed every page with his phone. He mailed the images to himself and to a secondary account he kept for documents that needed to exist in more than one place. Addressed 2 envelopes, one to himself at the Decatur apartment, one to Sandra Anderson at the cleaning company's dispatch office. Because Sandra had the particular quality of someone who holds on to things without asking what they're for and could locate them some 6 months later without being reminded. He sealed the envelopes and put stamps on them and set them on the corner of the table to mail Monday. Then he went to the grocery store because he needed food. Because there was nothing else he could do today except make sure the documentation existed and wait to see which direction it came from. The thing about seeing patterns clearly was that it didn't give you control over them. Sometimes you saw exactly what was approaching, and the only available move was to make sure you had an accurate record and then to stand in the right place when it arrived. Monday arrived with the particular quality of a day whose outcome has already been determined, coming to deliver its confirmation. Monica was at her desk at 6. The outside audit team, 3 professionals from a firm the company's counsel had engaged Friday evening, was arriving at 9 with a specific mandate. The modification history for the financial operations system over the past 60 days, filtered by user, beginning with the entries counsel had flagged from the raw log. Monica had given counsel everything. Not Victor's summary. The raw output, the metadata, the formatted document she'd found in the CFO's archive subfolder. Tariff records from Callaway Technology she'd located in the financial system once she knew where to look.
3 payments.
Spanning 4 months. Totaling 2 months. $1 million. Direct credited to a personal account associated with Victor Bryant's name via a private banking arrangement that was visible once you knew to look for it, and designed to be invisible if you didn't. Victor had called the board of directors Friday afternoon and requested an emergency security briefing for Monday morning at 10. Monica had been informed but not consulted. She'd let him set it. A man who sets the time and place of his own confrontation is a man who believes he's in control of the outcome, and a man who believes that makes choices a careful man would not. She needed Victor to make exactly those choices. At 8:45, Pamela came in with coffee and said, "James is here." He came in at 8. He wanted to wait in the lobby, but I brought him up to the small conference room. Monica looked at her coffee. Why did he come in? He said he wanted to return the access badge before the audit team logged in. She looked at Pamela. What badge? The temporary authorization from last week. He said he wanted to make sure it was back in the system as returned before 9. Monica picked up the coffee. Just tell him to wait. At 9:15, the audit team settled into the secondary conference room with full system access, and the specific polite skepticism of professionals who have been engaged to find something and expect to find it. Monica had told them to start with the modification history and work backward through the usernames. She'd told them to pull the metadata on every entry, not just the entries themselves. And she'd told them the technology division's Q2 reconciliation records were within their mandate, because something in the fixed income pattern had suggested a parallel structure somewhere else, and she wanted to know if she was right. At 9:45, she walked to the small conference room. James was at the table, temporary badge on the table surface in front of him, coffee from the lobby machine, long past hot. He'd been reading something on his phone, not anything dramatic she could tell, just the ordinary news of a Monday morning, and he put it away when she came in. Monica sat across from him. "You didn't need to come in. I wanted the badge in the system as returned before the audit team started their access log review." He looked at the badge on the table. A badge that's still technically active when an audit team pulls the log creates a question. A badge that's been returned creates a clean record. That's a detail. Details are what audits look at. She looked at him for a moment, the steadiness of him, the way he occupied a space without requiring the space to adjust itself around his presence. Victor called a board briefing. 10 o'clock. He's presenting the unauthorized access documentation. I know. How? Because it's the next logical move. His hands were flat on the table. He has the formatted document ready, the one characterizing my accesses as sabotage. He has the board as his audience, and the audit team being on site creates time pressure he can use. If he gets a board resolution before the audit team produces their findings, the resolution becomes the official position regardless of what the audit finds after. He paused. He's moving before the findings can move first. Monica looked at him. What do you want out of this? Whatever happens in the next hour. The question landed and sat there. James looked at the badge, then out the window beside the conference room, not Monica's window, a different angle, more street and less skyline, the Decatur side of his commute in reverse. A delivery truck idling 23 floors below. I want it to be accurate, he said. Whatever else happens, whatever you need to do, whatever the company needs, whatever the outcome is for me. I want what's on the record to reflect what actually happened. He looked back at her. I fixed things. I didn't break them. I need that to be in the record somewhere, before it gets buried under a story that says otherwise. Monica was quiet for 3 seconds. It's in the record. He nodded once. Then I'll wait.
She
Picked up her coffee.
Don't leave.
James looked at the badge on the table. I'm not going anywhere. The boardroom at 10 had the specific weight of a room where power is being redistributed, not announced, not visible. Present in the way people chose their chairs, and the way the conversations that had been happening when Monica walked in ended the moment she crossed the threshold. Victor was already positioned, seated to her right, laptop open, printed summaries face down in front of each of the 8 board members, with the precision of someone who has prepared this room and wants the preparation to be legible. His expression was the expression he wore when he'd done something well and expected the room to confirm it. Monica sat at the head of the table. Victor nodded to her, the nod of someone who expects to run what comes next. She nodded back. He began methodically. Victor always began with frame before content, establishing the interpretive structure first, so that by the time the facts arrived, they were already inside a conclusion that shaped how they would be read. Security vulnerability. Unauthorized as access pattern. 7 documented instances. An employee without credentials, it's clear, who had accessed restricted financial systems repeatedly over 3 weeks and who had been present at every system incident during that window. The board read the summary. Thomas Jackson, 22 years on this board. A man who had seen enough boardroom presentations to recognize when one was moving faster than the evidence beneath it, had his summary open but was watching Victor rather than reading it. Victor moved toward the resolution. Termination of the cleaning contract. Documentation filed with the audit team. The situation characterized as resolved before it became a problem for the Shiguk transaction. Monica let him finish. Then she opened her laptop. Before the board takes any action, I'd like to share what the audit team found this morning. Victor's expression didn't shift. The audit team has been on site for 45 minutes. They started at 9:15 with a specific mandate. Monica turned the laptop so the screen faced the room. On it, the modification log. The 47 entry. The username clear and unambiguous. This is the system record from the night the financial error was introduced. The error that brought this situation to everyone's attention, the $487. 3 million reporting discrepancy that was corrected overnight. The board looked at the screen. Victor had gone still in the way he went still, not visibly, nothing our cat would catch. But Monica had spent 8 years learning to read the particular quality of his stillness, and she read it now. This is the username attached to the modification. She let the board read it without narrating it. Let the silence hold for exactly long enough.
V. Brian.
Thomas Jackson looked up from the screen.
Looked at Victor.
Said nothing. The maintenance employee's accesses are documented here. Monica scrolled to the secondary log. Each one occurs after the introduction of the original error. Each one is a correction. The audit team's preliminary characterization as of a few minutes ago is remediation activity, not sabotage, remediation. The room held the specific silence of many people recalibrating simultaneously. Victor's voice, when it arrived, maintained its register. Modification logs can be altered after the fact. They can. Monica moved to the next screen, which is why the audit team pulled the metadata. The timestamp architecture on the 11. Full-7 entry tree is consistent with a manual input by a credentialed user working in real time, not a scripted retroactive entry. The millisecond intervals between keystrokes match human typing patterns, not automated generation. She moved to the next screen. Additionally, there are transfer records from Callaway Kinotology to her personal account associated with the CFO's name. 3 payments across 4 months, totaling $1 million. She looked at Victor directly, without performance of any kind. Gary Young is the CEO of Callaway Technology. He is your cousin. Thomas Jackson placed his printed summary face down on the table. Victor didn't answer. The board waited. One of the members, the one who joined 18 months ago from a risk management background, and who had been watching the room rather than the laptop throughout, looked at Victor with the expression of someone who has just finished adding a column and arrived at a number they were hoping not to arrive at. A different board member said quietly, "Victor, do you want to respond?" Victor looked at Monica, and for the first time in 8 years of sitting across from her in rooms like this one, calculation behind his eyes had stopped running. He looked at her the way a man looks at something when the math has finished and the answer is not what he built the equation to produce. "I built this department," he said. 8 years, I know. Monica's voice carried no aggression, no satisfaction, nothing performative. Just the fact of it. "And I need you to leave now." He stood, buttoned his jacket, the specific reflex of someone whose public presentation has always functioned as a form of protection, reaching for the one thing still available. He walked to the door without making eye contact with any of the board members. At the door he stopped and turned back to the room. He didn't say anything else, then left. The door closed with the quiet of something heavy being set down deliberately rather than dropped. Thomas Jackson looked at Monica. In the silence after the door closed, the board member who'd come from risk management exhaled in a way that wasn't quite a breath and wasn't quite a word. It was the sound a room makes when it's been holding something and finally doesn't have to anymore. "How long have you known?" Thomas said. "Certain since Friday night. Suspicious longer." Monica closed the laptop. The maintenance employee, James Carter, is in the small conference room at the end of this hall. He came in this morning at 8 to return his temporary access badge before the audit team started their log review. She looked at Thomas. He wanted the record to be clean. Thomas Jackson looked at the door through which Victor had just walked, then back at Monica. Something moved through his expression, not quite a smile, not quite surprise. The particular expression of a man who has seen many versions of a given story and is noting carefully which version this one is. "Bring him in," Thomas said. James was still at the table in the small conference room when Pamela came for him. Badge still on the table, coffee unreachable, cold now. He'd gone back to the news on his phone, not because it was interesting. but because creating without anything for the hands to do was worse than waiting with something. Even something that didn't matter. He stood when Pamela appeared, looked at her face. "Main conference room," she said. "Monica is asking for you." He put the phone in his pocket, looked at the badge on the table, left it, walked the length of the floor, past Brian Thompson's desk where Brian was looking at his screen with the focused intentionality visibly focused on his screen, past the kitchen, past the copy room where Victor had stood near the copier and spoken to him about his position and his future. Walked through all of it and pushed open the conference room door. 8 board members, Monica at the head of the table, laptops and printed summaries and treasured in the air of a conversation that had already happened and been resolved. Thomas Jackson was the one who spoke. "James Carter." James stood just inside the door. "Yes. Monica tells us you've been documenting system anomalies for the past several weeks." "Yes. In your own notebook, your own time." Yes, Thomas Jackson had the subtle quality of a man who had spent 22 years on boards learning that the most important thing a board does is determine what actually happened. Not the presentation of it, not the framing of it, but the actual sequence of events. "Walk us through what you found. Start from the beginning." James looked at Monica. She looked back at him with nothing directive in her face. No indication of what to say or how much. "Just this room is yours right now." He pulled out the nearest chair, sat, put his hands flat on the table, the way he always settled himself before working through something carefully. The way his uncle had taught him to sit before opening a spreadsheet that needed real attention. 11 days before the night Monica found me in the CFO's office, he began. "I noticed a rounding inconsistency in the fixed income summary while I wasn't cleaning one of the monitors on the floor. Small, technically within acceptable parameters on its own, but the modification timestamp and the cells it affected matched a pattern I'd seen before, in other contexts, where the small things were precursors to larger ones. I went back through 3 weeks of archived reports that evening, on the screens while I was cleaning, and found the same pattern of small adjustments. Same username, same methodology, same direction of movement." Thomas Jackson leaned forward slightly. "What did you do?" "I started a notebook. Date, time, the specific cells affected, the modification timestamps, the username attached to each entry." He paused. "I wrote it down because I understood that a man in a maintenance uniform pointing at a CFO's modification history and saying something looks wrong here would not be received as a contribution. It would be received as overreach. So I documented, and I waited." The room was quiet in a way that was different from the quiet before Victor had left. That had been a tense quiet, built from what hadn't been said yet. This was the quiet of a room that adjusts to hurts and so and everything else in the room and needs a moment to accommodate it. The board member from risk management said, "You understood documenting might make you a liability." "Yes, and you did it anyway." James looked at her. "I could not do it. The same way I could not fix the error at 2 in the morning." He was quiet for 1 second, not for effect, just for cash. "You can decide to walk away from something that's wrong. You can get in the elevator. But if you actually understand what you saw, and you know what it means, the elevator doesn't take you anywhere you can actually stay." Thomas Jackson wrote something on the face-down summary in front of him. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Monica said, "Thank you, James," and the board began its work. The audit team's preliminary findings arrived at 2:15. Unauthorized modifications by a credentialed CFO-level user consistent with an attempt to manipulate valuation basis for a prospective asset sale. Financial arrangement between the CFO and the prospective buyer documented through transfer records. The maintenance employee's 7 systems accesses characterized, without exception, as remediation activity. Corrections made in response to anomalies the employee had identified and preserved in his own documentation. Outside counsel was on the phone with Monica by 2:30. By 4:30, Victor Bryant's credentials had been revoked from all company systems. By 5, 2 people Monica had not previously met were in Victor's office. She didn't supervise the process and didn't need to. James had been moved at some point in the afternoon from the small conference room to the empty office on the south side of the floor. The one that had sat vacant since a director left 6 months ago and hadn't been reassigned. Pamela had brought him lunch. He'd eaten it. He'd spent the afternoon doing what people do when they've done everything they can do, and arguingly, not performatively waiting. Which is to say, he'd been sitting with the specific quality of a man at rest, not a man performing rest. Monica found him there at 5:15. He was at the window. The side window, the view that wasn't the skyline, the view of the edges building and the street 23 floors below where the delivery truck that had been idling was long gone. Just Atlanta ordinary, doing what it did. "It's handled," she said. He turned around. "Yes." She came into the room. The desk behind him was empty, nothing on its surface, no one's history accumulated in the drawers. The office had the quality of a room in the process of becoming something without yet knowing what. The audit team's findings are consistent with everything in your notebook. Outside counsel is coordinating with the SEC and the relevant federal authorities. She stood near the window, not at the desk. Gary Young's company will not be acquiring the technology division. James nodded. "You were right," Monica said. "About all of it. I know." He said it without satisfaction, the way you confirm something you've known for long enough that the confirmation is just the loop closing, not a new thing. "I'm sorry it took the shape it took. What shape did you think it would take?" He thought about that honestly. "I thought he'd find a way to move faster than the documentation. I've worked in enough buildings to know that the person with the credentials and the title usually wins regardless of what the log says." He looked at the window. Being right and being in a position where being right determines the outcome, those aren't the same thing. I've been the person in the maintenance uniform in enough rooms to know that. Monica was quiet. The stress was filling with the particular energy of Atlanta for 5 music fishing on a Monday, people are going and things, away from things, the ordinary machinery. "Now tonight you go home," she said. "Tomorrow we talk about what comes next." He picked up his jacket from the back of the desk chair, started toward the door, stopped. "The woman?" She asked why I documented when I understood it made me a liability. Monica looked at him. I didn't give her the whole answer. She waited. James looked at the empty desk, at the room that was waiting to become something. "I documented because the alternative was watching something get broken from the inside by someone who know exactly how to make the breaking look like maintenance. And I cannot." He stopped, started again. "I can't watch something get broken and decide it isn't my problem. Not because that's heroic. Because it's the only way I know how to be in a room, any room." Monica looked at him, at the 11 days of notes and the 15 years of rooms behind them, compressed into the quality of the way he stood when he said something he meant completely. "I know," she nodded. Walked out. Pamela, at her desk and not appearing to have heard anything, held out his badge from the small conference room as he passed. He'd left it on the table and she'd retrieved it, already knowing he'd need it back eventually, already knowing she'd be the one to bridge that gap. James took the badge, walked to the elevator, pressed the button. In the elevator going down alone, with his jacket over his arm and the notebook in the inside pocket, and Atlanta arriving through the lobby glass as the floors counted down, he stood straight and thought about what it meant for the record to say the accurate thing, to have stood in a room at the right moment and told the right people the right version of what had happened. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like the number adding up to what it was supposed to add up to. For James Carter, those had always been the same thing. 3 days passed. James worked his shifts. Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night. Clock in at 10 through the service entrance. Cart from the supply room on the basement level. Floor 23, and then floor 22, and then the server corridor and back up. The same route he'd run for 3 years. With the same precision, the same systematic attention to what was in front of him. But the floor was different now. Not visibly. The workstations were where they'd always been. The kitchen still had the espresso machine that was better than the paper towels deserved, and the paper towels that confirmed it. The server corridor still carried the specific smell of recycled air and electronics running at the high end of their rated temperature. None of the physical things had moved, but the quality of the silence had changed in a way that was itself information. It was the silence of a floor full of people who knew something significant had happened, and were still working out what it meant, and what their relationship to it was. Who had watched Victor Bryant's office get cleared out Monday afternoon by 2 people nobody but recognized and nobody asked about. Who had before present in the building when the audit team arrived, and were now waiting for some official version of events that hadn't materialized yet, which meant the unofficial version had been circulating at full speed since Tuesday morning. James moved through all of it with the same quality of presence always brought to the floor. Not performing normalcy, just doing the work. On Thursday night, Brian Thompson was at his desk at 10:15, and this time when James came down the row, Brian looked up. Not the earlier look, not the one that went through its sequence of category assignment, before landing somewhere uncomfortable. Just a direct look. The kind you give someone when you know who they are, and you're still in the process of deciding what that means for how you behave going forward. James nodded once, kept moving. Brian looked back at his screen. In the kitchen, the espresso machine had been cleaned by someone other than James, imperfectly, with the specific kind of imperfect that comes from someone who cleans something because it needs cleaning, rather than because they understand how the thing works. James noted it without judgment, because it wasn't his machine and he had no standing to have opinions about it. There was also a new box of paper towels on the counter. Better ones, the absorbent kind. James picked up the box, looked at it for a moment, filed it under things that were true regardless of context, and set it back down. At 11:45, coming out of the server corridor, he found Pamela at her desk. Pamela's hours were 8 to 6 with a punctuality that's expressed something about her character, a belief in the integrity of boundaries, including the temporal ones. She was not a person who stayed late for the sake of staying late, and she was not a person who came in early without a reason. She was at her desk now, computer on, a cup of tea at her right hand, with the settled quality of someone who has decided to be somewhere and has fully committed it to that decision. She looked up when he came around the corner. "Monica's asking if you have a few minutes." James looked at the cart, looked at Pamela. "Now works." She said no rush. Pamela picked up her tea. But she's been here since 7 this morning, so her definition of no rush is doing some work tonight. James parked the cart against the wall beside the server corridor entrance. "I can go now." Monica's office was lit the way it got after a long day, desk lamp only, not the overhead fixtures. The specific choice of someone who has been working for 16 hours and has started making small concessions to the fact that their eyes are tired. The Atlanta skyline outside held its lights against the dock in the way it always did, though at 11:45 on a Thursday it had a different quality than it had at 2 in the morning or at 8 in the evening, quieter, more settled, the city in the part of the night when it has decided what it is until morning. Monica was at her desk. She looked up when he came. Something in her face shifted, not surprise she'd sent for him, but something with the quality of relief that has been held is only now being set down. "Sit down." He sat. She had a folder on her desk, one specific folder, centered. Monica organized her desk by processing priority, things waiting for her attention arranged by urgency and sequence. She centered things only when they were waiting for a specific event rather than being worked on. This folder had been placed there and left there waiting. "The audit team completed their formal report this afternoon," she said. "Outside counsel reviewed it tonight." James waited. Victor's modification history is fully documented. The pattern of adjustments to the fixed income summary, the ones you noted in your notebook beginning 11 days before the 2 a.m. situation, those are included in the findings along with the 11:40 entry and a document he'd created in the CFO's archive labeled for the Chicago auditors that characterized your accesses as sabotage. Monica looked at the folder. Counsel's characterization is that the modification pattern, combined with the financial arrangement with guaranteed company, constitutes actionable fraud in federal securities law. What does actionable mean in practice? The company is filing a formal complaint with the SEC and cooperating fully with the federal investigation. She met his eyes. This doesn't stop at termination. It goes further than that. James absorbed that. Outside the window, the skyline held its position. The technology division. Status. Monica opened the folder for the third time, turning pages until she found the one she wanted. The Chicago investors were briefed this morning. They're reviewing the audit report, and the current indication is that the Chicago transaction proceeds as originally structured. Without the asset sale, Victor was engineering as a condition. She looked at the page. That division generates 61% of our annual revenue. Victor knew that. The sale would have damaged the company's long-term position substantially while generating a short-term return that benefited exactly 2 people. She closed the folder. Your notebook, the audit team's findings, and the Chicago investors' decision to stay are all connected. That connection is direct. James looked at his hands on the arm of the chair. The notebook is in the formal record. Counsel has a copy. The audit team has a copy. The SEC filing will reference it. Monica's expression had the quality of someone who has done something that matters and is still integrating the weight of it. 11 days of documentation. Time-stamped. SL specific, the full modification pattern traced from origin to the 11 entry. She looked at him. You understood what you were seeing before anyone in this organization did? I knew something was wrong with the numbers, he said. I didn't know what the numbers were being used for. Those are different things. Monica was quiet for a moment. The desk lamp made the particular quality of light that overhead fixtures can't, warmer, more directed. The kind of light that makes a room feel like a room where something real is being said rather than a room where official things are being done. I want to talk about what comes next, she said. For you. James waited. He'd learned enough about Monica Reed over the past 2 weeks to understand that she arrived at things in her own sequence, and that the correct move was to stay in the room and not fill the space she was crossing. She slid the first folder to the side, opened a second one, centered it the same way. The company needs someone in risk management and internal controls, she said. Not a title that existed before this week. A function that clearly existed and was clearly either not being performed or was being actively subverted. She looked at the open folder. What you did over the past 3 weeks is a more rigorous version of what a functional internal audit practice does. You identified a pattern. You documented it with precision. You maintained the integrity of the documentation under direct professional pressure. You preserved copies through multiple channels before Victor could eliminate the primary record. She looked at him. That's exactly what us internal controls is supposed to do when it's working. James looked at the folder. Upside down from where he sat, he couldn't read the specifics. He could see his name at the top of the first page. He could see a title line below it. I didn't finish my degree, he said. I know. I have 2 years of accounting coursework and 15 years of self-directed study and a notebook. And a track record that exists whether or not a credential attaches to it. Monica's voice carried the patience of someone who has already run through the objections and knows where each one lands. You documented and preserved evidence of fraud being committed by a credentialed CFO with a Wharton MBA and 26 years of professional experience. The notebook beat the MBA. That's not nothing. That's what the position is built for. James looked at the window, the Atlanta November pressing against the glass. What's the offer? Monica turned the folder around. He read it. The title, the scope description, the prohartamo structure, compensation line. Read the compensation line again, looked up. That's 6 figures. Yes. Starting, yes. He looked at the folder again, with the specific quality of someone looking at an accurate number they are having difficulty integrating. Monica.
James, I clean floors.
You did clean floors. She leaned forward slightly, not to close distance but to make the distinction land correctly. You also identified and documented a financial fraud that 12 credentialed analysts and a CFO with decades of professional experience missed across 6 weeks of accumulation. You fixed 3 acute system failures, 2 of them in high-pressure situations where the cost of failure was significant. You maintained the integrity of evidence under conditions designed to eliminate it. She paused 1 beat. And you reorganized my personal schedule on a Friday night, using access you'd obtained through the calendar system, the same temporary authorization gave you access to, because you could see from the log that 7 consecutive meetings without a break was an unsustainable load, and the logical intervention was obvious. James was quiet for a moment. Then something moved at the corner of his mouth, not a smile, not fully formed, but moving in that direction. You noticed that. Pamela told me within the hour. Monica sat back. She also said you'd done a better job than she would have. Pamela's generous. Pamela is accurate, but she's generous with her time, not with her assessments. James looked at the folder, at his name at the top, at the compensation line that represented a number Ed had put in his personal spreadsheet as a target for 5 years from now, not for the current moment, sitting at the top of a job description that was, in structure and function, a formalization of exactly what he'd been doing informally and without recognition for 3 years in this building. I have a condition, he said. Monica waited. I want to finish the degree. He met her eyes with the directness he brought to everything that mattered to him. Not because I believe I need the credential to do the work. Because I started it 15 years ago for a reason. And I stopped for a reason. And the reason I stopped no longer applies, and I want to close the open item. He paused. I want the company to support that while I'm in this role. Monica looked at him for 3 seconds. Georgia State has an evening accounting program. Based on your Morgan State transcript, you'd need approximately 18 months of coursework to complete the degree. The company has a tuition support policy that covers full-time employees in role-relevant programs. She held his gaze. The policy is in the employee handbook. James absorbed that. You already looked it up. I looked it up Monday morning. She slid the folder another inch toward him. Before I knew what your conditions would be. He looked at the folder, at his name, at the number, at Monica Reed, who had found him in her CFO's chair at 2:17 in the morning and hadn't called security, who had instead come back at 7:30 and asked him to walk her through his background, and who had then spent a week navigating between the easy choice and the correct one, and had ultimately chosen correctly, in a room full of people who were waiting to see which way she'd fall. He thought about what it meant to be actually seen, not to be a surprise, not to be applauded for the unexpectedness of existing, to be seen, the work recognized as work, the care recognized as care, the 15 years of not stopping recognized as what it was. He picked up the pen Pamela had left beside the folder. One more condition. Monica waited. If I see something wrong, I say so directly, without routing it through 14 approval layers of first to determine whether I'm authorized to notice it. He looked at her steadily. That's not negotiable. It's the only way this function works. Monica looked at him for a long moment. If you see something wrong and don't say so directly, I'll consider that a failure to perform your primary job responsibility. He signed. The next morning was a Friday. James came in at 8, not 10, not for the night shift, but 8 in the morning, in a button-down shirt and dark slacks, and shoes that were not work boots, which was a categorical difference significant enough that Pamela, who had seen everything that happened on floor 23 for 15 years and maintained a careful professional neutrality about most of it, though looked up from her desk when he came through and did not quite manage to neutralize her expression before it registered. Good morning, she said, and meant both words. Morning, Pamela. He meant them back. Monica wasn't in yet. Her office was dark, which was the first time in 2 weeks James had arrived to find it that way. And Pamela said she'd had a late call with outside counsel and was coming in at 9, which was, Pamela moved without editorializing, the latest start Monica Reed had had in recorded history, at least in Pamela's 15 years of recording it. The office on the south side of the floor, the one that had been empty when James had sat in it Monday afternoon waiting for the board meeting to finish, had been prepared. Pamela had put her chair behind the desk and a notepad in the corner, and a coffee from the good place 2 blocks down sitting in the center of the desk surface. James sat down, looked at the desk, looked at the window, the side view, Atlanta and the adjacent building, and the street where delivery trucks came and went at their own rhythms. He put the pen cup on the desk. It was a can he'd cleaned and sanded himself, a method he'd used for years to make a functional organizer that traveled with him between apartments and jobs, without requiring anything from anyone. Not decorative. He held 4 pens, mechanical pencil and a small ruler. It had been used long enough to be invisible to him in the way that things you've had for a long time become invisible, not noticed, just present. Part of the equipment of being who he was. He put it in the upper left corner, where it would stay out of the way when he was working and within reach when he needed it. Then he opened the laptop Pamela had set up and started reading the last 90 days of internal audit records. Because the audit team had addressed the targeted investigation. But 6 weeks of accumulation from Victor's patent remained in the underlying systems, and accumulation didn't disappear when its source was removed. It sat there in the records, waiting to compound if nobody looked at it. He found the first residual issue at 8. A fumble was a formula offset in the fixed income reconciliation. Brian Thompson's team had partially corrected it, catching the visible error but missing a downstream reference that the visible error had been masking. 11 cells, small individually, compounding towards something that wouldn't be small. James documented it, wrote it up in the format he'd developed in the notebook, the problem stated precisely, the cells identified specifically, the proposed correction explained, the timeline for impact if left unaddressed. Added it to a file he labeled Open Items. Marked it Priority 2. To needs addressing before the next reporting cycle, not acute. He was midway through the second quarter's records when Brian Thompson appeared at the open door at 9:15. Brian looked at James at the desk, at the open laptop, At the pen cup in the upper left corner. At the room that had been empty for 6 months and was now occupied by someone Brian had been corrected by twice and had not thanked for either correction. I heard you're in risk management now. James stopped. Correct. A pause that contained several things. I found the row reference error, the one you flagged on Tuesday night. You were right. I know. Brian looked at the doorframe. Something moved through his expression, not quite discomfort, something more disciplined than that. The expression of and making a professional accounting and finding the balance isn't in his favor. I should have responded differently when you told me. Yes. Another pause. Brian had built his professional identity on the careful management of information, the calibrated disclosure of acknowledgement, the precise calibration of what he owed to whom and in what form. This conversation was operating outside that system, and he knew it. If your team finds things in my team's work going forward, I'd rather hear it directly from you than through an official report. James held his gaze steadily. That's how it'll work regardless. I don't root around people unless the situation requires it. Brian nodded. Once. The specific nod of a man making a commitment he understands the cost of. He left. James went back to the second quarter's records. At 9:32, Monica arrived. He heard her heels on the floor of the hallway. She'd gone back to wearing them, which seemed like a fact that contained information without requiring interpretation. And a brief exchange with Pamela, whose words didn't carry but whose tone did. And then her office light came on. She didn't come to his office immediately. She had things to do. She always had things to do, and that was not going to change because he now had an office on the same floor. Her function and his function were different and adjacent and both necessary, and the structure of the days would reflect that. James kept reading. At 10:15, one of the junior analysts knocked on the open door. She had been with the company 8 months. James do this the way he knew most things about the floor, from the accumulation of being present in a place over time. And she had the particular quality of someone who had been spending those 8 months trying to determine whether her own instincts about the work were reliable, or whether she was simply too new to know what she didn't know yet. She had a laptop under her arm. Pamela said you'd be going through the quarterly reconciliation files. I have a question about the pivot table structure in the Q2 summary. Brian said to ask you. James looked up. Sit down. She sat, opened the laptop. Lobster pulled up the file and walked him through the question. A genuine question, specific and technical. The kind that comes from someone who has been doing the actual work and hit an actual wall, rather than someone performing the doing of the work for an audience. He found the issue in the structure in about 40 seconds. Explained it. Watched the shift in her expression as the explanation arrived, the particular change that happens when confusion resolves into an understanding, which was, in James's experience, one of the clearest things you could see happen in a person. That makes sense, she said. I thought I was making it more complicated than it needed to be. It is complicated, but it has an internal logic. Once you see the logic, the complication becomes structure, and structure is something you can work with. She looked at the corrected pivot table. Can I bring other questions? That's what the office is for. She left. James went back to the Q2 records. At 11 o'clock, he found the second residual issue, more significant than the first. A position valuation in the technology division's Q2 report that had been adjusted using the same methodology Victor had applied to the fixed income summary. Small changes distributed across multiple cells, each one with an individual tolerance, collectively shifting the division's apparent value downward by 2% across the reporting period. Victor had been running 2 parallel constructions simultaneously. The fixed income summary to create the crisis narrative. The technology division valuation to make the sale price appear reasonable. The audit team's mandate had been scoped to the financial operations system based on the primary fraud. Counsel had given them the option scope to avoid James started instinct through the records before anyone knew to look at the technology division separately, which was why the audit team's report hadn't caught it. James documented it, wrote it up, marked it priority 1, sent it to Monica. Her response came 4 minutes later, a single line to you. She was at his door in 6 minutes, which meant she'd read it twice before moving, which was Monica Reed's version of responding immediately. She had her phone in her hand and the expression she wore when something required action, and she was already taking it. This is from the Technology Division's Q2 reconciliation. Buried in the summary. The adjustments start 8 weeks ago. James had the comparison on his screen, the clean version overlaid against the adjusted one. Same signature as the fixed income pattern. Same methodology. Same direction of movement. The audit team's scope covered financial operations. Nobody told them to pull the technology division records separately, so they didn't. Victor was running both tracks at once. 2 different systems, same method, same destination. The fixed income adjustments created the crisis rationale. The technology division adjustments made the sale price defensible. He looked at the screen. If the sale had gone through on the numbers that existed as of last week, the buyers would have acquired something worth more than they paid. The sellers would have received less than the asset's actual value. And the difference would have moved through Gary Young's company in a way that connected back to Victor's account. Monica was already dialing. She was halfway out the door, stopped, looked back. Good catch. It's in the records. I just read them. The conversation she was able to have expand the scope of the federal investigation by at least a week and would pull the technology division's full financial history into the review. This was the correct outcome. It was also the outcome that required someone to sit in a room on their first morning in a new position and read 90 days of quarterly reconciliation records without being asked to. James added a note to the file. Went back to the records, lunch. He'd brought food from home, rice and chicken in a container, the same practical meal he'd been making and carrying to work for years because it was reliable, and he could eat it at a desk without requiring equipment or ceremony. He ate at his desk, kept reading. At 12:45, Monica came back. The council call was done. The audit team was being given an expanded mandate to cover the technology division's full Q2 records. Priority 1 was the correct call. She sat down in the guest chair. There was now a guest chair across from the desk. Because Pamela had put one there the same morning, she used to put the notepad in the coffee, which was itself information, and looked at him. How are you doing? She asked. James looked up from the container. Fine. That's the short answer. He looked at her. She had the expression of someone who's asked a real question and is waiting for the real answer rather than the socially acceptable abbreviated version. It was different from the professional expression she deployed in meetings and different from the direct expression she'd had in the conference room at 7:30. Something with fewer layers on it. He put the fork down. It's a lot to integrate. 3 days ago I was on the cleaning contract. Today I have an office and the audit team is expanding based on something I found at 11 this morning. He looked at the desk, at the pen cup in the corner. It's a lot. Is it too much? No. He looked up, but it's a lot. Monica nodded with the someone who has had this simple experience herself and is not going to pretend an otherwise. When I was getting this company started, she said, I had a desk in a sublease office, 2 clients, and a business plan I was 90% certain about and 10% terrified of. Every morning for the first 3 years I sat at that desk and wondered whether the 90% was actually 40%, and I just didn't have enough information yet to know the difference. James looked at her. What result? Vault. The work itself. She looked at the window. When I was in the work, I knew what was true. It was only when I stepped back from it that the doubt had room to enter. The work was always clearer than everything around it. She looked back at him. You've been in the work your entire professional life. Different work than you anticipated in different rooms. But you know what's true when you're in it. James was quiet for a moment. The pivot table question this morning. I saw what was wrong with it in about 40 seconds. That's going to be what it's like, repeatedly. Monica stood. Don't minimize it. It doesn't serve anyone here if you minimize what you can actually do. At the door, finish your lunch. She left. James looked at the container, looked at the pen cup, looked at the side window and the ordinary Atlanta street below it. He picked up the fork, finished the rice. The press conference was Mocca's shaped by her conversation with the Thomas Jackson who had said, do it once and do it right. Not a crisis management press conference, not a company at a podium explaining a failure. Something more specific, aimed at the business press, the Chicago investors communications team, the board members who were still processing what had happened, and the broader professional community that would form its own account of this story, regardless of whether anyone gave them accurate information to work from. It was a Thursday, 2 weeks after the board meeting. 10 days after James had come in for his first morning shift. Monica told him about it on a Wednesday afternoon, standing in his doorway with her jacket still on, which meant she'd just come back from something external.
button in the...
Why? Because the people in that room need to understand what actually happened here. Not just the fraud, the correction. The story of how something like this gets caught is as important as the story of what's being caught. She looked at him steadily, and because the account of what you did deserves to be in the record in a room where it can't be edited afterward. James thought about that. Okay, wear something other than the button down. I have other things. Good. The second-floor auditorium held 30 people, journalists from the Atlanta Business Press and 2 national outlets, the Chicago Investors Communications representative, 3 board members including Thomas Jackson, and a cross-section of senior staff. Monica at the podium, Pamela at the side wall with the attentiveness she brought to events where attentiveness mattered. James stood near the back wall. He'd worn the charcoal suit he kept for occasions where a charcoal suit was the right answer, which were not frequent but which he'd always been prepared. He stood with his hands in his pockets, present without acquiring rooms to enrich itself around his presence. Monica went through it methodically, the fraud pattern, the modification history, the parallel structures in 2 divisions, the audit findings, the federal investigation, and the company's cooperation with it, the expansion of scope that James's first morning discovery had triggered. She used the language of someone who has processed something fully and is now reporting on it rather than someone still working through it while speaking. Then she said, "The fraud was identified and documented by James Carter, who was at the time a member of our facilities maintenance team. 30 people. Some had pens on notepads, some had laptops open, all of them in the specific way of rooms where something affects in the middle of unexpected things. Stop they were doing and located James at the back of the room." Monica said, "Mr. Carter spent 11 days before the acute crisis documenting a modification pattern in our financial system. In his own time, in his own notebook, without authorization or instruction. He did this because he had been trained to read financial systems, because as what he thought systems was wrong, and because he was constitutionally incapable of seeing something wrong and deciding it wasn't his concern." A journalist's hand went up. Monica nodded. "Where is he now?" "Mr. Carter. He's in internal risk management and financial controls. He started 10 days ago. Yesterday he identified a secondary fraud in our technology division reconciliation that has expanded the scope of the federal investigation." Another hand. "What was his role before?" "Facilities maintenance." Monica's voice held no apology and no narrative frame around the fact. Just the fact, stated plainly. "He cleaned this building, absorbed this." Not with laughter. Not with the particular performance of being impressed that masks the fact that the impression is really just surprise. With the specific quiet of people updating a working model and taking the time to complete the update properly. The Chicago Investors representative, a woman who had been at the original Chicago meeting and had watched James fix the surloop in 15 seconds while holding a porcelain coffee cup, wrote something on her notepad, and then looked up at the back of the room and gave a single brief nod. The kind that acknowledges someone without making a display of the acknowledgement. James nodded back. Monica answered every question. She was thorough and didn't rush any of it. At the end, the lesson I take from what happened here is not complicated. It is about what you're looking for and where you're looking for it. We had someone in this building who understood precisely what was happening in our systems and had the precision and the integrity to document it accurately over weeks, under conditions designed to make that documentation impossible. We almost missed that entirely because of the uniform he was wearing when he found it. A pause. "That's a mistake I won't make again." The room started to applaud. There was a beat first, the beat of people deciding whether this moment called for applause or just for silence. And then it started and the others followed, and it was the genuine kind. The kind that comes from a room that has heard something true and is responding to the truth of it. James stood at the back and let it happen. Thought about the elevator going down on Monday night. About the number adding up to what it was supposed to add up to. About the up in the upper left corner of the desk on the south side of floor 23. The applause was for the surprise of him. He'd understood that since the Chicago investors in the conference room and the thing he'd said to Monica about bicycles and dogs. So, what remained was the record. The record said what had actually happened. That was the thing that mattered. After, the room cleared in the gradual, clustered way of people who have absorbed something and need motion to process it. Monica was at the front with the Chicago representative. Thomas Jackson had his hand on another board member's shoulder, speaking in the low continuous register he used when working through implications. James was moving toward the exit when Pamela materialized beside him, without drama, simply present in the way she was always present when she was needed. She handed him a folder. Inside, a printed schedule for Georgia State University's evening accounting program, with the enrollment deadline highlighted in yellow. A note in Pamela's hanging at the top. HR has the tuition form ready whenever you are. James looked at the folder. You already had this. Monica asked me to pull the information on Monday. I had the form ready by Tuesday, but your first week seemed like enough. A pause. It's been more than a week. James has looked in the enrollment deadline. Classes start in 6 weeks. The registration window closes in 11 days. Pamela's met his eyes with the directness she applied to things that mattered. I can walk you through the HR form this afternoon if you have 20 minutes. He had 20 minutes. He had, more than that, the first clear forward horizon he'd had in 15 years, the first sense that the time between now and the thing he'd been carrying as an unopened item was not an obstacle, but just time. Crossable. This afternoon, he said. Pamela nodded and moved toward the door, with the efficiency of someone who has already mentally filed this task as complete and moved to the next one. James looked at the folder, at the enrollment deadline, at the course list, Financial Accounting 2, Intermediate Managerial Accounting, Auditing Theory in Practice, and 3 electives to be determined. Auditing Theory in Practice. He was going to find that one useful. Monica found him in the hallway outside the auditorium, the folder open in his hands, reading the course list. She'd changed something since coming off the podium. Not her clothes, not anything visible, but the quality of her attention had shifted. The press conference had required the outward-facing projection of Monica Reed as CEO, which was real and not a performance, but was also not the complete set of what she was. Now she was moving through her own building the way she moved through it when she wasn't projecting anything for anyone. She stopped beside him. Look at the folder, Pamela, he said. Pamela. She looked at the course list. Auditing Theory is a good class. The textbook is dry, but the applications are the point. I gathered that already. Monica leaned against the hallway wall, something she didn't typically do. But the hallway was empty, and the press conference was behind them. And the day had settled into a particular quality, like something that had been in motion coming to rest. You handled that well, in the room. I stood in the back. You stood in the back and let it be accurate. She looked at him. For you, that is handling it well. He looked at her. The hallway was ordinary. Atlanta was doing whatever it was doing on the other side of the building's glass, indifferent as always to the specific weight of particular moments. He said, I want to ask you something. Monica waited. She was good at waiting, at occupying the space without filling it. He'd noticed in 730 conference room and had continued to notice it last week. He looked at the folder, then at her. In my office, y'all said when you were in the work you knew what was true. Yes. Is that still true for you? Right now. Monica was quiet for a moment. Somewhere outside, a truck braked on the street below, the familiar sound of the building's block doing its ordinary business. When I found you in Victor's office at 2 a.m, she said, I had been awake for 20 hours trying to solve something I couldn't solve. I found you solving it. My first response was to reach for my phone to call security. She paused. My second response was to let you finish. James was looking at her. My third response after the screen turned green and you went back to the mop was to think, I don't know what to do with this yet, but I know that making a fast decision about it would be the wrong move. She met his eyes. The things I know to be true about something important tend to arrive in that order. Not immediately. Not after the fast decision. After I've stayed with something long enough to know what it actually is. And what is this? The hallway held the question for a moment. The truck had moved on. The building was its ordinary self. Somewhere on 23, Brian Thompson was doing his work, and the junior analyst, whose name James would shortly learn, was working on variance analysis, and Pamela was walking toward HR with a tuition form and an enrollment deadline and 11 days of clear time ahead of it. Monica said, I think this is the function this company should have had from the beginning. The part that actually looks at what's in the systems rather than assuming it's fine because nothing has exploded yet. And then before the sentence could become something it didn't need to be right now.
The risk function. The control. That.
James looked at the folder. That's one answer. It's an accurate answer. She pushed off the wall. There's another one. He waited. She looked at him with the expression she'd had at the desk on Thursday night. The desk lamp and the centered folder and the quality of someone fun arriving at something after sitting with it long enough to know what it was. That one can wait until it looks clearer. For both of us, she started toward the elevator. James said, "Monica," she stopped, turned, "the third button on your jacket." He pointed. The button was slightly off-center in its closure, the thread worn thin on one side. "The thread is going. It'll come off before end of day." Monica looked down at the button, then at James with the expression of someone who is absorbing, without performing the absorption, the fact that this was now what it was going to be like. The thread noticed, the axis identified, the row reference off by one. Everything that was slightly wrong caught before it compounded into something that couldn't be easily fixed. "I'll have Pamela look at it," she said. "Pamela's in HR doing your paperwork right now. Then I'll address it myself." She turned back toward the elevator. "Finish the Q3 records this afternoon. Thomas wants a summary by Monday. I'll have it by Friday." She pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. She stepped in. James stood in the hallway with the Georgia State folder and the pen in his jacket pocket and the South Side office waiting on 23 with its side window and the ordinary Atlanta street below it and the pen cup he'd made from a soup can sitting in the upper left corner of the desk, and thought that accurate was, ultimately, the most important word he knew. Not perfect, not finished, not arrived at some final destination, just accurate, in the present tense. 3 months later, the office had acquired things. Not many. James was not someone who accumulated objects for the sake of having them, but enough to mark the space as inhabited by a specific person. The pen cup, a second monitor he'd requested through facilities, because the work required seeing 2 files simultaneously without tabbing between them. A whiteboard mounted on the south wall, where he tracked open items in 2 columns, identified and resolved. Pamela had brought a small succulent at some point and set it on the corner of the desk, where it was doing the uncomplicated work of being alive without requiring much from anyone. The resolved column was longer than the identified column. That was the metric James held himself to. Not defects. 0 defects in a system this complex wasn't a realistic target. Resolution rate was the target. Problems found and addressed before they compounded was the thing that mattered, not the absence of problems, because the absence of problems was not a thing a financial system this size was capable of producing on its own. It needed someone looking at it. That was what the function was for. He had 17 items in the open column on a Tuesday morning in November when the junior analyst, whose name was Angela Walker, and who had in the past 10 days moved from pivot table questions to variance analysis questions, which was a meaningful change in sophistication, knocked on the open door with her laptop. Not a pivot table question this time. A question about the variance analysis methodology in the technology division's monthly reconciliation, which was a genuine question that required sitting down and working through together rather than pointing at a formula. They worked through it for 40 minutes. At the end, Angela closed the laptop, looked at the whiteboard. "I want to get better at seeing the pattern, the way you see them." A pause. "Is that something that can be taught?" James looked at the 2 columns, at the 17 open items, each one a pattern that had become visible to him in the ordinary reading of records that were now his to read every day. "It's not a technique," he said. "It's more like you learn the structure of what's supposed to be true. The deeper you know the structure, the more clearly anything that deviates from it registers. It makes a sound." He looked at her. "The more you know, the louder the sound." Angela looked at the whiteboard. "How do you learn the structure?" "You read everything. For a long time." He picked up a marker, uncapped it, added a note to item 12. "And you don't look away from the things that don't fit."
She stood.
At the door, she stopped. "Brian said you're taking classes at Georgia State Tuesday and Thursday evenings, auditing theory, and financial accounting too, and intermediate managerial." He looked at the open items. "Having the formal framework for things I already know turns out to be more useful than I expected. It gives me language for what I see, which makes it easier to explain to people who need to act on it." Angela left. James turned back to the whiteboard, added a second note to item 12. A position in the fixed income summary that had been correctly entered but was referencing an outdated benchmark rate. A small drift that would become a medium problem if left alone through 2 more reporting cycles. Priority 2. He'd brought it to Brian's team on Friday. They were working on the correction today. He opened the Q4 records on the primary monitor, Q3 comparison on the secondary. Outside, Atlanta was doing what Atlanta did in November. A cold front pushing through. The sky through the side window flat and bright in the specific way of days when weather is coming. Everything slightly sharper than usual against the approaching change. At 11:15, Monica came to his door. She didn't do this every day. Some days he didn't see her at all, which was correct. His function didn't require him to be in her orbit, and hers didn't require her to be in his. They worked in adjacent rooms on connected problems, and that was what the structure was supposed to look like. But sometimes she came by with a question or a document or the specific quality of someone checking on something they'd built and wanting to see how it was standing. Thomas wants a Q4 risk summary for the board meeting. End of November. Draft by the 15th. He's also asking about the open items methodology, how the tracking system works. I can present it at the meeting. James looked at the whiteboard. It's more legible in person than on paper. Monica looked at the whiteboard too, at the two columns, at the succulent doing its quiet work in the corner, at the banana cup in the upper left, the same one that had been there since the first morning. You're good in this room, she said. James looked at the open items, at the side window, at November Atlanta pressing up against the glass. I'm good with the work, he said. The room is just where the work is. Monica looked at him for a moment with the expression she sometimes had when something landed in a way she hadn't quite expected. Not amusement exactly, but something in the same family as it. Then she turned toward the door, stopped. The board meeting is the 14th. She didn't turn back. Thomas does a dinner the evening before every quarter. His place in Buckhead. A pause with a specific quality to it. It's not mandatory for staff, but it's a room you should be in. James looked at the whiteboard. At item 17. What time? 7. She was already moving. Pamela has the address. James added a note to item 17. Close to Q3 secondary monitor. Opened blank document and started the Q4 risk summary structure. Because Thomas wanted it by the 15th and James Carter did not bring things in late. And also because the work was there. And the work was what he knew how to do and what he was good at. And those facts had not changed. Outside, the cold front was finishing its arrival. Atlanta settling into the new weather. The street below adjusting the way streets adjust. People moving slightly faster, collars up, the ordinary choreography of a city deciding what the afternoon was going to require of it. And in the South Side office, on the 23rd floor of a building with his name now in the organizational chart for the first time in 15 years, James Carter worked through the afternoon with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who has found the room where the work is and has understood, finally and completely, that the room is his to stay in. The open items column had 16 entries by end of day. One problem found, one problem resolved, accurate in the present tense, and still going.